Good evening, everyone. Let me introduce our second speaker for the day, Professor Maria Thaker. She is a faculty at the Center for Ecological Sciences at IISER here at Bengaluru, and her research interests mainly lie in the broad areas of behavior and ecology. Today, she'll be telling us about the optimality and geometry of foraging in the wild. Let's welcome her for today's talk.
Thank you. You can hear me, yes? Great. Okay, let me start with this. What did you have for lunch today? Loudly. I mean, louder, louder. This room is vacuous. So, pasta, not bad. What else?
Chicken.
Chicken, dal, beans, rice. Excellent. Okay, so when you think about what to eat, what do you think about? Are you thinking about how many calories you want to eat? For those of you who are weight conscious. How many of you think calories? It's important to think about calories when you eat. Great. No, great. I'm glad you're not counting calories. Live a little. Good. Okay, how many of you think about, I mean, obviously taste, that's important. That goes without saying. Yes, for sure. Right? Is it yummy or not? Okay. What about how much protein should I eat? Dootika cares about protein. How many of you care about protein? How many of you care about not eating too much fat? Or not too much carbs? Or maybe lots of carbs if you're a runner. So food is a lot of things, right? What to eat and how we make decisions about what to eat is quite a bit. Animals do the same thing, actually. So what should an animal eat? Right? Should an animal eat everything it sees? Right? Look, it's walking around and it's like, yum, 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 I'll eat everything I see. How many of you think that's what an animal does? Okay, nobody. Should an animal then alternatively make random choices about what to eat? As it walks, it's like, oh, I'll eat this bug, but I won't eat that one. Or I'll eat, this leaf, but not that one. Do you think it's random or arbitrary? You're the first group of people who actually are attributing a lot of intelligence to animals here. That they're not eating randomly, they're not eating everything they see, which by default means they're making some decisions about what to eat and what not to eat also, right? Okay. So I want to start with a quotation by David Lack. So from 1956, he was an ornithologist, which means he studied birds. And this is what he said. It was to be expected that swifts would avoid insects that were too large for them to manage, and that extremely small ones would not be taken. But a more subtle selection for size was revealed by analysis of the males. So he was sitting in his backyard and like writing down how big the insects were that were in the beaks of these swifts. Okay? And he says in fine weather, the males consisted chiefly of insects 5 to 8 mm long, but in poor weather, 2 to 5 mm long. He goes on to say, now, insects 2 to 5 mm long are commoner in fine than in poor weather, and are more numerous than larger insects in all types of weather. Presumably, in fine weather, when larger insects are plentiful, swifts can collect a meal more quickly if they do not go out of their way to catch smaller kinds. So there's some efficiency here, it seems, no? In bad weather, on the other hand, insects are so scarce that the swifts cannot afford to be selective. So this is from my observations of what swifts are eating, swifts are birds, obviously, what swifts are eating in terms of the insects. And it incorporates a couple of pieces of information. One, they're not eating everything, right? They're eating certain sizes. Two, it matters what's available. And let me see. And if they're scarce, which means there's not many insects out, then let's not be so selective. But if they're plentiful, then I'm going to be, as a swift, a bit choosier. Now, this is the origin, these observations is the origin of optimal foraging theory. These kinds of models were developed 10 years later. Observations like this were done by biologists all over, and we realized that we need to be, we, obviously not me, I was not around then, but biologists realized that we actually can mathematically predict what animals eat. And it's not random, and it's not everything. And so these models were developed about 10 years later and have gone far. And I want to say that when we think about what those swifts are eating, we can use this term. They were being efficient or optimal, right? So these optimal foraging theories were trying to model optimality. So then let's ask this question. What do I mean when I say optimal? What do you understand by that term? Just the English meaning of optimal. What does optimal mean? The what? The correct amount, the best amount? Yeah, okay, okay. Anything else? Anyone want to add more to that? There's a denominator too, right? The numerator is how much? The denominator, minimizing costs. So you're absolutely right. An optimal decision is one that maximizes the benefits while minimizing the costs. And the goal, as an evolutionary biologist would think about it, and as an animal in the real world would think about it, is to maximize fitness. So now let's ask the question, what is fitness? Not that. What is an evolutionary biologist's definition of a fitness? So when I say, as an evolutionary biologist, that one individual is fitter than another, what am I saying? Yes, that's right, more progeny. I'm talking about Darwinian fitness here, not physical health fitness here, even though that's somewhat related. Darwinian fitness is increasing your reproductive success. So passing down as many copies of genes from one generation to the next. So every behavior an animal does, as a behavioral ecologist or an evolutionary biologist, I think about this as a way for them to achieve the highest fitness possible. So when they're making a foraging decision, if I eat this, is it going to increase my fitness or not? Is it going to increase the number of copies of genes I can pass to the next generation? Is it going to make me live longer, be stronger, have more offspring, get more mates to have more offspring, so on and so forth, right? Increase this. Okay, so the goal is to maximize fitness, which means foraging maximizes fitness. And so when we think about these optimality models, we need to know a few things. We need to know first what decision the animal is making. Right? Eat this or not, for example. We need to know what currency it's using in this optimality, and if there are any constraints. So for example, right, if the question is what to eat, right, the decision is a behavioral option. Should I eat one prey type or many? So for example, some animals are very specialized. They will only eat one thing only, right? Very specialized. Other animals are generalized. They can eat lots of different things. Some animals have the option of doing anything in between, right? They can choose to only eat one thing or eat a lot of variation, right? So should I eat one prey type or more? Or should I eat this prey type or another? Should I eat the big blue bug or the small red bug? Right? Those are different types of bugs. Right? What is the cost and benefit of eating one versus the other? So that would be a decision, a behavioral option that the animal has. What's the currency? Right? This is what they're trying to optimize. Right? What are they trying to maximize? What are they trying to achieve? So they're trying to achieve energy gain over time. Spend the least amount of time possible to get the most amount of energy possible. That's the most efficient way to eat, as opposed to spending all day outside trying to find food and getting very little in return. Not very efficient at all. So an animal's currency is energy gain over time. in these classic models. Right? This, we think of, is a proxy for Darwinian fitness. Right? So an animal that's super efficient, gets a lot of energy for very little time, right, is more likely to have higher Darwinian fitness than one that isn't, because he now has all that extra time to spend doing other things. And he's got all this energy that he got for such little time spent getting it. Right? So actually, a more efficient animal is probably going to leave more copies of its genes in the next generation. And then finally, constraints. Right? We're not, us and animals are not 100% efficient. Right? We're built rather poorly. Certainly humans are built rather poorly. And so there are ecological or biological constraints with this maximization of energy. And so here are some, right? There's time, right? The temporal constraint, for example. How much time you actually have to forage during the day. And how much time it takes you to process or handle the food. So for example, if you're an animal who's eating a shellfish, right, it takes a long time for you to open that hard shell and get the food inside, right? That's a lot of processing time. Right? We have to factor that into the denominator when you're maximizing energy over how long it took to get that energy. There's also energetic constraints. For example, walking around to look for food uses energy. So then if you're trying to get energy, but then you're spending energy trying to find it, right, you can't overspend your energy flying to faraway places or walking great distances because you've now used up so much energy without getting anything back. And then you've got cognitive. You have to be able to know what is and isn't food. So for example, if you can't tell the difference between something that's toxic versus something that's delicious and good for you, then you're in trouble. So you have to know. You also have to be able to process it. So for example, and I'll go back here for a second, that's a very big nut for that squirrel, right? And so it works because it fits in its mouth, but there's actually a processing problem, right? Like there are bigger nuts in the world, like a coconut would be great, but that's just not going to work for a squirrel. So that's a processing problem, right? So that's a mechanical constraint. But then there are also physiological constraints, right? So some animals eat toxic insects that they now have to digest and they now have to have the right kind of enzymes to detoxify the dangerous parts of those prey, right? So all of these constraints have to be built in when we think about what to eat and what not to eat. Now, the first sets of these optimal foraging models were really great. And they predicted two main bodies of decisions. One is what to eat, right? Diet choice itself. Should I specialize on one thing or generalize on many? They also predicted how long to forage in a patch. So for example, animals that have to go to a food source and then forage there and then come home. Right? It predicts how long they should be in that patch before coming home. And those models they're called marginal value theorem models, because the longer you stay, the less you get out of it. So there's marginal value from staying in that patch. Now, I'm setting this all up, but I'm not actually going to go through these models. I'm letting you know that these models were really good and very accurate in predicting what animals ate, where they went, how long they stayed in the patch before coming home. So they worked really well. But they all use the same currency, energy maximization over time. In the beginning, I asked you, how many of you count calories or think about calories? Calories is energy maximization over time, right? How many calories you get for the time you spend finding that food and eating that food. And we all decided counting calories is not a good way. It may not also be a good way for a real animal in the real world to optimize their decision making. Because food is more than calories. Food is proteins, fats, carbohydrates, right? We don't actually eat calories. We eat carbohydrates that have calories. We eat proteins that have calories. So I could eat proteins and carbohydrates, and there'd be different things, right? They're different types of molecules, and they could have the same calories. So it doesn't actually help me understand what an animal eats in the wild, because it's not going out there and counting calories and be like, I need 40 calories today, or 400, or 1,000 calories. Do I eat that all in carbs? Do I eat that all in proteins? Do I eat that all in fat? Because I can get my calories from fat also, right? Maybe we need to be thinking about food the way animals think about, the way we think about, as actual food, which is not calories. So I want to introduce you to Stephen Simpson and David Robbenheimer. They developed this way of thinking about optimal foraging that applies to us as well. And this is one of their books, The Nature of Nutrition, and the figures that will follow came from there. Right? And they developed the geometric framework of nutrition. And these are the two first papers that they put out there. So here's what they said. They said, let's think about what happens to the food we eat first. And we'll put it in a geometric framework. So the first thing we think about is we ingest food. Right? We eat food. All animals do. So when I say we, I mean humans and animals, okay? We're all the same. So animals eat food, and then what happens? Some of it gets retained in the body. Some of it goes away, right? Some of it gets released afterwards, disassociated. So for example, we ingest a whole bunch of nutrients. Then we retain some of it for fitness gains, which means to build muscle, to give the necessary energy to cells, to produce offspring. That's all fitness gains, right? To grow and survive and produce offspring. So some of it is retained for that purpose. Some of it is retained for no benefit, right? I have 2-3 inches of that I'm trying to get rid of, right? No benefit, extra fat. So we've got some of it that's retained for no benefit. An animal actually, like a wild animal, has very little of this, in fact. Mostly they're here. They're not really overeating so that they're retaining for no benefit. And then a bunch of it goes away. Right? A bunch of the nutrients that are consumed goes away because some of it is disassociated after use. Metabolism, defense secretions. We need all that energy or nutrients to run our bodies. But once you run it, the heat that we lose is gone. Or if you're an animal that has to produce defense secretions, so in fact, sweat. That's a secretion that came from nutrients you ate that has been processed and now changed form. But once it goes, it goes. So some of it goes away. And then finally, we remove some of it as waste. Okay, so what we eat has lots of destinations. Now let's think about this geometrically. So suppose we think of food as proteins and carbohydrates. Right? And so this is an XY graph with proteins going from low to high and carbohydrates going from low to high. Okay? And suppose an animal needs this amount of protein and this amount of carbohydrates to grow and maintain its body and have whatever fitness outcome. It's got to eat more than this amount of protein and more than this amount of carbohydrates because some of it goes out in waste, right? So you can't just eat what you need because a whole bunch of it is going to be removed as feces or released in metabolic processes. And so you'll end up here, actually. But if we include how much gets lost in waste, then you actually need an intake target that's higher, a higher protein to carb ratio. You following? Okay. Now suppose this is it, right? You have an animal that needs that for optimal fitness. We're still trying to optimize fitness here. So it needs this amount of proteins and carbs to optimize fitness. Right? And it lives in a world full of leaves that has that protein to carb ratio. Good for it, right? Because now what it needs to do is just eat these leaves. It eats a little bit of these leaves, a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, and by the end of the day, if it's eaten just these leaves, it would have achieved its intake target for the day for maximal fitness. Yeah? Okay. The world is not just one leaf or one type of leaf. So let's add different types of food. Okay. So for example, leaves that have higher protein, lower carbs than mangoes, which is my favorite fruit of all time, and it's mango season now. So of course, mangoes, which have higher carbs, lower protein than leaves, right? So imagine your world where you only have two options, mangoes and leaves. I'd eat mangoes, but suppose my intake target was here, where for optimal fitness, I need this protein to carb ratio. What should I do? Eat leaves, right? Okay. Right? And I can just eat leaves because the ratio of protein to carbs is what this line is, right? So a little bit of it will give me the same ratio, it's just a smaller amount. And then I keep eating until I achieve the intake target for the day. So let me give you now some definitions for the words I've been using. So the intake target I've been saying is the amount and balance of protein and carbohydrates that an animal needs to achieve maximal fitness. This dotted line that defines leaves or defines mangoes is what we call the nutrient rail. Okay, this is the balance of nutrients in each of the food item. So an animal eats up the rail, right? Little bit, but it's still on that rail. The space between these two dotted lines is the nutrient space. That's the available nutrient balance encompassed by various food types in the environment. So now food can be balanced or imbalanced. Right? So if your intake target is here, then leaves are nutritionally balanced for you. If your intake target was here, which I wish it was for me, then this would be nutritional balance. But given the animal who needs this protein to carb ratio, that is imbalanced, right? Okay, good. I'm glad you're with me now. So what happens if you live in a world where you've got two food items, mangoes and beans, and your intake target is not on either rail, right? Which is likely, right? Like, what's the odds that you live in a world where beans are perfect for you, right? Your intake target is somewhere in between the nutrient space. What do? You eat a combo, right? You can eat some mango, some beans, and you hit there. Or mango beans, mango beans, mango beans, and then you hit your intake target. Right? Great. Because your food, your intake target is in the middle of your nutrient space, so you can do that. What if you live in a world where your intake target is outside the nutrient space? That's a problem for you, right? So animals have two options. When nutritionally imbalanced food is available, they have to resolve that trade-off by over-ingesting some nutrients and under-ingesting others. So there are two possibilities here for that animal, right? They could go here. They could eat mangoes, right? So that, and eat enough of it so they meet the carbohydrate needs for the day. Right? The problem with that is too little protein. Correct? You seeing how I'm reading this graph? Everybody follow? Great. Okay. So that's option one. Eat mangoes only till here. Enough carbs, not enough protein. Option two is eat mangoes till here. So eat a lot more mangoes. At which point you've met your protein target, but you have overeaten your carbs. This rule of compromise, right, puts an animal in a very difficult situation. It either undereats something or overeats another. Okay? This will come back at the very, very end of my talk. Okay, so now how do we know what an intake target is for an animal? So let me share with you an example from a paper that was published in 1995, one of the first papers to test these ideas. And what Chambers did was he and colleagues put locusts in the lab and gave them powdered proteins and carbs in different ratios. They either gave them a high protein, low carb option and a low protein, high carb option, side by side, okay? And then they measured how much the locust ate. Right? And every day they weighed those powders to say, well, how much of this nutrient rail was eaten and how much of this nutrient rail was eaten, okay? Because those are the only two rails option. And they found this. Everybody ate a tight protein to carb ratio, which means they regulated really well how much they wanted to eat and how much of this they ate and how much of this they ate to get there, okay? So locusts can do this. They know the difference between a high carb diet and a low carb diet. Almost all animals can. So for example, grizzly bears eat salmon and fruit, even though they can get higher energy, more calories from eating salmon only. But they also eat fruit because to gain the maximum amount of mass, they need this ratio. Spiders do this. They actually suck out juices from the prey, not just as a whole, but relatively, so they could suck out more of some nutrients and less of others. You're thinking, well, how can carnivores deal with this, right? Carnivores only eat meat, and if they eat meat, then that's all protein diet. What carnivores have done is actually evolve ways to convert proteins back into carbohydrates. They no longer can regulate glucose, so they can no longer eat carbohydrates. Right? They've evolved to no longer eat carbohydrates, but they now have new enzymes that can convert amino acids back to glucose. So at the end, even though they're eating a high protein diet, they're still ultimately adjusting their protein to carb ratio after they eat. Okay, so now let me tell you about what we've done in the lab. Okay, given this background, I wanted to know what animals eat. And I wanted to study it in two contrasting environments. Here, which should look somewhat familiar to you, which is around Bangalore. You've got these gorgeous rolling hills. And there's an animal that lives here that I'm interested in. And this is the Thar Desert. This is not there's green, lots of vegetation, lots of things to eat here. And it's a desert, so that's a tougher life here. And I wanted to contrast these two animals to understand how they regulate their nutrient needs. So let's start here. Let's start with Bangalore and the rocky outcrops of Karnataka. Here lives this animal, which is the Indian rockagama. Actually, if you look around on your campus, on the outside walls, you will see this guy if you haven't seen him already. Okay, this is a male. This species eats insects. Right? It's a sit and wait predator, which means it doesn't chase the insects around. It sits, and when it sees an insect, it ambushes it and gets it. It is also eaten by many predators. So it's not just a predator itself, but it's food for others. Right? So predatory birds, dogs, snakes, all eat this. So the questions we wanted to ask was, what do rockagamas eat? Right? Does the nutritional content of their diets change across seasons? Right? So I'm a dietitian here with wild animals. And does stress influence diets? So here's a small tangent. Does stress influence what you eat? Yeah? When you're stressed, what do you crave? Chocolate. How many of you chocolate? Yeah, sweets. How many of you chips? Right, carbs. That's right. That's what stress does. Right? Stress actually increases your metabolic rate, at which point you need to fuel your body some more. So you're hungry for easily convertible carbohydrates, which is sugar and carbs, right? So chips and chocolate for sure. So we wanted to ask, well, if you're a stressed out lizard, do you crave carbs? And so here's what we did. Step one, we sampled lizards, males and females, across seasons and locations. And this work was done very brilliantly by my PhD student, Avik Banerjee. And so Avik went out and he sampled lizards before they started breeding in the summer, while they were breeding, and then at the end of the breeding summer, like early breeding and late breeding. Okay? He went out and he caught a whole bunch of animals. And then we did a bunch of things. First thing we did was to take blood sample. And the blood sample allowed us to test for stress-induced hormones, so corticosterone. So as humans, when you're stressed, you release cortisol, which I can measure in blood, in saliva, in your hair, on your skin. It's everywhere. Okay? So when you release that hormone, it's an indicator of how stressed you are and how much you're experiencing that stress. The equivalent for other vertebrates is corticosterone, but it does the same thing that cortisol does. So we use that blood to measure corticosterone levels. We also measure its circulating glucose levels with one of those little things. If you've got a diabetic family member, you know what I'm talking about. This is a little handheld glucometer. And then we also wanted to see what they're eating, right? So I want to know how stressed they are. And then I want to know what they're eating. So we actually have the lizard in our hand here. And we flush water. I mean, it's kind of gross, but really awesome as well. We put water in its gut, so it vomits out the food in its stomach. Sorry. And then we go back. And then we identify everything that was in its stomach. Okay? So science is messy, yeah? This is what it takes. So we gut flush the animal. We identify everything, and this is Fahiz, who is just an amazing entomologist, and he spent the summer looking in a microscope and telling us what these lizards ate. Okay, so now we know what they ate. We know what their stress levels are. And then we collected their poo. So for a different set of, this is not to scale, we collected the poo or a different set of animals, not the animals that we gut flushed, because we wanted the poo from the food they ate, right? So we collected them and then let them give us the fecal sample. And we estimated carbon and nitrogen content from the fecal sample. Okay. And then finally, I needed to know, so we know what they ate, but we needed to know what the carbon and nitrogen values were of that. Like how much of that is protein and carbs, right? So we have to go back out into the wild, catch insects. And so this is Avik again, catching insects. Right? We bring those insects back into the lab and we measure the carbon and nitrogen content of every single insect that we found in the diet. We multiplied that with how much they ate of those different insects. And ultimately, we know what their protein to carb ratio is, right? And then we wanted to make sure that maybe, are they being selective or are they just eating whatever's out there? So we also figured out what the abundance of the different insects were in the wild. So this was tough work. Again, Avik was amazing. So what did we discover? Well, animals have different levels of stress across seasons. And so our measure of stress is that hormone value, corticosterone. So that's your y-axis. The x-axis is body size. And these are the different seasons. So for example, you can see here right away that at the end of the breeding season, these values the corticosterone levels are lower. So after breeding is all over, everybody is not so stressed anymore. But during the breeding season and early breeding season, it's like, let's go, let's go, let's go. They're stressed. Males and females have different stress levels. Right? And size matters. So bigger individuals, not so stressed. Little individuals, a lot more stress. You can see that. Maybe they get bullied in the wild. I don't know. But here we are, right? So animals have different stress levels, which then is great for us because we wanted to know, if you are here, a high-stressed individual, are you eating more carbs? Versus if you are here, a low-stressed individual. Okay. Well, what we also discovered is they eat different things. And it doesn't necessarily match up with what's in the wild. Right? So there can be all these insects in the wild, but they love ants. And they like some Hymenoptera and some beetles and so on and so forth. And this varies a little bit from season to season. Sorry, there was a question? Yes, go ahead. No, wait, I have to come to you. I can't hear you. That's a really good question. They don't have tests like you do. Why would an animal even get stressed? Well, it's tough to defend your territory because there are other males who also want to fight with you. That's stressful. You've got to find a female to mate with. What? That's one thing. Life is tough for them also. A predator chases you, right? If you're a lizard in the wild and a raptor comes and tries to catch you, or a dog comes and tries to catch you, that is scary and stressful. And so we'll release that hormone. You have to go out every day and defend your territory, right? So you have to walk around and show how tough you are. That is stressful, right? You may lose a fight with someone. That's stressful. So animals absolutely experience stress. Not as chronically as we do, but they certainly do. Okay, now we analyze the protein to carb ratio, and I'm showing you carbon and nitrogen, okay? Because I want you to just think about them in its basic elements. So nitrogen for protein, carbon for carbohydrate. Huh? And in fact, even though they're different types of insects, actually their protein to carb ratio is fairly similar. So the nutrient rail accessible to these lizards is actually here. There are a whole bunch of different insects out there, yes. But what they're eating is more or less the same protein to carb ratio. And then when we compared males and females, we found out that females ate more carbon and nitrogen than males per body weight. And if I look at it in this form, in the pre-breeding season, everybody ate, both males and females ate the same carbon-nitrogen ratio. And then as breeding increased, females ate more carbon and more nitrogen, even more carbon and more nitrogen. Males started to reduce how much they ate. Okay, so what about this whole stress level? Right, that was my hypothesis. I eat cake and I wanted to know if animals did too. Turns out stress did not affect the ratio of protein to carbs they ate. It didn't affect how much carbs they ate or how much nitrogen, or how much proteins they ate. What it did affect was how much they pooped out, how much they excreted. Stressed individuals actually excreted less carbon and nitrogen. So if you think about that for a second, I don't have to change what I eat. I can just hold on to what I eat and not release it. That's also a very good strategy. Okay, so the conclusion one from story one. Okay? From an insectivorous lizard. The availability of insects in the wild varied across seasons. Individuals also had different stress levels. Despite the fact that your physiology is different, some are more stressed than others, and the world is providing you different things, everybody maintained a tight intake ratio of 4.5 carbon to nitrogen. This means these lizards do not need extra carbs when they're stressed. They don't eat extra carbs. What they do, in fact, is they retain more carbon and nitrogen from what they eat. And they're not actually retaining only more carbon, which is my hypothesis, so I was actually wrong with we didn't show this. They retain both carbon and nitrogen, which means they're retaining more calories altogether, right? More energy. I don't know. We're doing those experiments now. I don't know how it'll turn out. Yeah, will they actually eat those more carbs? Yeah, I don't know. Okay, story two is a shorter story. Okay? Let's go to the Thar Desert in Rajasthan. Here is one of my favorite animals, the spiny-tailed lizard. Look at the cute little face. He's mostly herbivorous, which means he eats plants. And it's a very interesting system because unlike most lizards in the world, this cares for their young. So mothers stay with their babies, well, for 2 weeks, but that's still cool. Okay, so babies hang around with their mothers will scold their babies. It's actually quite amazing. So there's parental care. Like the lizards in Bangalore, they are prey for many predators because they're small, so birds eat them and dogs eat them and so on. Right? They build burrows, which means they build holes in the ground, and they hibernate over winter. Now, questions here is, what do spiny-tailed lizards eat? And does the nutritional content of diet change across seasons? So the same two questions. No stress element here. Not now, at least. And so this work was done by Mihir Joshi, which was really tough work, because now he erected these little tents in the middle of the Thar Desert all year round. So winter where it's nice and comfortable, and summer where you just like want to die. And he sat in here with binoculars and he watched spinies eat. And he measured every single bite that the lizard took. So if you ever see me here, pat him on the back for a job well done. And so the question again, what do they eat in the desert? Right? So they mainly eat 4 plants. There are 10 different plants out there, but they mainly eat 4 plants. And what you see here, you don't have to worry about the details. On the x-axis are the different types of plants. But what is available, which we know because we put grids out and counted what was available. What is available is blue. What they ate is in yellow. Okay? So they're not eating exactly what is available, right? Some things could be available, but they ate less of it. Other things could be less available, but they ate more of it. So they weren't eating exactly what was out there. There's some shifts. And as you can see here, April, June, August, and October, those bars change. So they shift what they're eating across the four months that he sampled this. Okay? And so this is the intake targets for them. In August, they ate lower nitrogen, and this is grams per day, lower carbon to nitrogen. In April, a little higher. In June, even higher. In October, even higher. So they're changing what they eat. And these nutrient ratios vary across seasons, which is different from what we saw with the breeding lizards of Bangalore. They're eating more nitrogen in June and more carbon in October. This is very interesting because in June, this is when the lizards are breeding actively. So females are making eggs. And so we hypothesize that higher nitrogen is higher protein to make eggs. And in October is just before they have to hibernate, which means they're packing on the carbs to make that tail of theirs full of fat so that when they hibernate, they have an energy reserve. Now, the question came to us right away is, how do these herbivores get extra protein or extra nitrogen in the breeding season when they want it? Well, it turns out they eat insects, which we did not expect at all when we went out there because they're supposed to be a herbivorous lizard. But they only eat insects in these 2 months, in the month of June and the month of August during the breeding season. So you see here some extra protein in the yellow that's shifting on this side and all that extra protein on this side. Okay. So conclusion 2 from desert lizards, and I'm almost done. The extreme environments of the desert is very different from the Bangalore rolling hills. Across the seasons, the environment varies a lot, right? Summer is dry. This is a picture of us in the field, and that's a little lizard. And look at that, there's nothing to eat really. It's not green and lush. And then contrast that with monsoon where it's actually nice and green and flush. So there's a lot of nutritional challenges here to eat in the desert. It's also hot and then very cold. So there's a lot of temperature variation. And what these desert lizards do is they shift their intake targets across the season. They're increasing the nitrogen intake during the breeding season, we think, to make babies. And they increase their carbon intake in preparation for winter hibernation. Right? So these animals can adjust their foraging behavior to satisfy the nutritional needs. And their nutritional needs change depending on what time of year it is. All right. So the reason I wanted to tell you about these 2 lizards was to convince you, even though it seems like you already knew, that animals don't eat randomly. They don't eat everything they see. And the fact that they actually can regulate means they know what they're doing, right? They're adjusting their nutrition for their requirements, which is pretty savvy. All right, what about us? What do we need? How much protein do you think we need? Give me a percentage. Do we need 50% protein? 50? No. More? 75%? Definitely. Okay, fine. So less than 50. What do you think the optimal ratio of optimal protein content is? Protein and then the rest. What do you think we need? Take a guess. No? No guesses? Faculty in the back? What do you think we need? Any other guesses? We need 15% protein. So Robbenheimer and Simpson and colleagues did this massive study. Good question. Need for maintenance. If you are young and growing, protein content needs to be higher. If you're pregnant and making a baby, protein content needs to be higher. To maintain an adult body, right, so that it's lean and mean and is a good machine, sorry, I couldn't help it, you need 15% protein. And they did this with a bunch of different studies. Here's just one citation where they gave people food that varied in protein and carbs, and naturally, people picked 15% consistently over and over again without actually knowing you're picking 15%. Your body knows it needs 15%. What happens if we eat less than 15%? You remember this? If we end up eating less than 15%, we will crave more calories. And we end up overeating calories in general because we're trying to get our 15%. So we will eat, and by default, we're actually eating other things, right? We're not eating just calories. So if we can't get 15% protein, when we eat calories, we're eating more carbs, we're eating more fats, we're eating more stuff, which means we overeat things we don't need in order to meet our protein needs. This is called the protein leverage hypothesis. Humans consistently show support for the protein leverage hypothesis, which means we eat our daily intakes, our cravings and our hungers are driven by our need to reach 15% protein. And when we reach it, we actually are not so hungry anymore. When we don't reach it, that's when we crave more calories because we're still looking for that 15%. Okay. So go get your Rajma tonight, okay? Get your 15% protein per day. That's it. Any questions? Thank you.
We know about that when we take carbohydrate, some part of the glucose is stored as glycogen in our body for when we need energy. For the glycogen, there will be glycogen breakdown.
That's
and
right.
It will suffer. And ma'am, that will be classified under retained for fitness gains or retained for no benefit. That you told, I just.
Okay. Does it? So bodies are efficient. So if we've got extra stores in terms of fats or carbohydrates, and we store our carbohydrates as fat, we will use it in times when we cannot get food. We and all animals. So the spiny-tailed lizards, for example, have that fat, fatty tail, which is packed with energy that they can convert it. Now, if we don't have that, we will start to convert protein to energy. So if we don't get enough food in general, right, then we will start doing what you're saying, which is converting protein back into usable carbohydrates, which means we're eating away muscle. Right? So those are not optimal times in that equation, right? Because we're now converting what we have in terms of stores, right, in muscle. That's not a good, the muscle is not where we store our buffer. We store our buffer as fats. Right? So if you now run out of your fat and you're converting muscle, you're no longer optimizing this equation. Right? You're in bad times.
So storage, any form of storage is retained for fitness gains or retained for
Storage, yes. So like the animals who have to hibernate actually store extra for fitness gains. Humans who overeat store extra for no gain. Right? This is rare in the world, right? If you look at wild animals that are living natural lives, they're not obese or not overweight. I will say that animals who are subsidized by humans, so like the langurs and the bonnet macaques that you see who get fed by people or who steal food from people, they are overweight. They're no longer regulating because now they're taking easy foods and not burning off what they need, right? If they were actually foraging in the wild. So it's storage for no fitness gain.
One last question. How do we determine intake target for a particular individual?
For who?
For a particular individual, intake target.
Yeah, actually, so basically you have to do what we did, which is watch every bite. And like, if you're talking, are you talking about humans or are you talking about like animals? Yeah, you have to watch every bite and measure the calories and the measure the protein and carb ratio of that. Because naturally, we and every animal has evolved to regulate well. Right? We've evolved through evolutionary processes, which means that we're actually very good at what we do in the world. So we should all be meeting our intake targets. So if you study an animal in the wild, you see what they're eating, you measure their protein and carb ratios. If you bring them into the lab, you give them protein to carb ratios that are different, and then you see what they eat. Right? It depends on the kind of animal. I can't bring an elephant in, so I can study them in the wild. But some animals, like insects, we can bring in and actually give them different ratios and see how much they eat.
I actually had a question. So for the spiny tail lizard, I saw that the data was made in alternate months. Is there a particular reason for it?
Because it's hard work and Mihir needed to sleep and rest his body and nutritionally fix. That's why he needed a break. Logistics.
Any further questions?
Oh, 100%. This comes up all the time. You're absolutely right. Just taking that blood sample itself is stressful, right? So we take blood and measure stress in different ways. One, I can, if I'm really fast, which I am for some species, in the sense that I can grab them and take a blood sample before they even know what hit them, I'm getting baseline levels of that hormone. That baseline level tells me, and you have it right now, you have cortisol circulating in you, even though you're not feeling stressed, you need that cortisol to move glucose around. It's an energy mobilizing hormone. So when you are stressed, you produce more of it because you're trying to move energy faster to your muscles because you've got to run away from that lion that's chasing you, or you've got to move it to your brain to quickly make good decisions. So I can measure its baseline for some species. For this one, we actually stressed them out. We held them for 30 minutes so that they would feel stressed. Then we took the blood sample. And that tells me how much of a response they produce if they were challenged, right? If a predator attacked them, if the food resource went away, something like that. What is the capacity of that system? So there's some individuals, as you see from that graph, that are like kind of chill when situation is bad. Other individuals are like, oh no, right? That tells you something, right? Like amongst us, some of us react to stressful events rather calmly, and others freak out. Right? That's what I'm measuring, degree of freak out. Yeah.
Why is the stress factor not taken for the lizards?
Because when we did that study, it's a protected species in Rajasthan. It's the only spiny-tailed lizard in India, and so it's highly protected. And we did it like around the COVID time, so we didn't actually have permission from the forest department to touch the animal. So we did it all from observing. Now we have it. Since then, we have now permits from the forest department to be able to measure them, and so we do have interesting blood-related information, but it doesn't fit the story, so I didn't tell you. So that's all it is. We didn't have permission to touch.
Will the stats change when the stress factor, like the first one?
I don't think. Well, will the story, the spiny story change?
Yeah.
The story won't change because this is how much they eat. What might be interesting is that this variation here, that range here. Why are some individuals lower, some higher? Because we couldn't catch them then, we actually don't know who's a girl and boy. Right? So it could be male, female that's causing the spread here. It could be lower stress individuals, higher stress individuals. Those pieces of information would help explain this spread. Right? But otherwise, it's not changing this. Right? The mean of that intake target is here. Whether or not you're stressed, you're somewhere in here. Yeah.
Anyone else? Cool. So let's thank the speaker again for that super
Thank you.
interesting talk.